All right, let's kick this off. Thank you so much for joining us. I am the Executive Director of Defend Our Health, and this is our last Authors and Friends Talk for 2025. We are really, really glad that you are here, whether you're joining us on the recording or in the live session. We appreciate your time and your interest. Today, we are really, really happy to bring you two wonderful speakers. We're going to talk a little bit about environmental sustainability, what kinds of things we as busy folks can do to really make real positive health actions that help our communities, help the country, really move us forward in a direction of hope and health and equity. And so we are very, very happy to have Cate Mingoya-LaFortune as the author of Climate Action for Busy People. We are also very excited to have Lenny Siegel, who is the Executive Director for the Center for Public Environmental Oversight. Sorry about that. And we're just so glad to have you here today. And before I hand it over to Cate and Lenny, I just wanted to let you know a little bit about what Defend Our Health does and why we are bringing these wonderful folks together. We are the environmental health and toxics organization that has helped to ban PFAS forever chemicals in consumer products. We have worked on plastics and PFAS and other toxic exposures that harm families and communities. And we really focus on moving towards places where there are actions we can take that are evidence-based, practical, and sustainable, and where there is a safer solution. A lot of the things that are happening in our economy, a lot of the products in our homes, things that are happening in our food systems, they can cause health harms that are very difficult for individuals to avoid. But when we come together and we take actions, like the author and our speakers are going to be talking about today, we really can make these practical steps and these changes that help not just you, but everyone in your community to live healthier, happier, and safer lives. So with that, we're really, really happy to have you here. Thank you so much. And I'm going to hand you over to Cate for our first presentation. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I am so glad that you're here. Thank you for joining us. My name is Cate. I'm the Chief Officer of Climate Resilience and Land Use at Groundwork USA, which is a national nonprofit. And I am the author of the recently released book, Climate Action for Busy People. I'm also a climate adaptation planner and community organizer by training. And a lot of us are experiencing the effects of a polar vortex right now. So you're probably quite cold in this moment. But if you can think back a couple months ago to summer, you might remember your phone going off with extreme heat notifications, which was pretty common this last summer and many summers prior. This summer, as you can expect, was the hottest summer on record and is likely to be one of the coolest that we have for the foreseeable future. And often when we talk about the climate crisis, historically, it's been in this wilderness global context. You're probably familiar with stories of polar bears drowning as they swim 10 plus miles between ice floes, or Antarctica and the Arctic reaching record temperatures, or snow crab populations declining because they can't find any place to lay their eggs. But if you're like me and you live in an urban environment, your experience with the consequences of the climate crisis probably looks a little closer to these images. Maybe it's nuisance flooding in your basement in the spring, or summers that are so hot that they're beginning to melt transportation infrastructure. Or if you are in the Northeast, you might remember a couple of years back where the sky was covered in this pink and orange haze as wildfire smoke blew over from the West Coast. And if all of this gives you what I call a case of the climate bubble guts, which is this churning anxiety about the climate crisis and its consequences and what you can do about it, I think that's super normal. You're paying the right amount of attention. This is alarming. It is really disturbing, but there are things that we can do. However, especially over the last 30, 40 years, the solutions that we've been given to the climate crisis have felt sort of flat compared to the severity of the consequences of the climate crisis. Things like not littering or recycling or line drying your laundry, all things you should probably try to do. But when your basement's flooded or when it's so hot your kids can't play outside, those things don't really feel super impactful. That's why I wrote the book Climate Action for Busy People. It's roughly divided into three parts, and I'll talk about many of these parts today. The first goes through why do things look the way that they do and takes a historical lens on why certain neighborhoods and communities within urban environments are hotter, wetter, or have worse air quality than others. Spoiler, it's not by accident, and that means it's not going to change by accident. The second part goes into what you can do right now. If you've got a case of the climate bubble guts, if you're nervous, if you want to effect change, but you've only got 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 10 minutes with some friends on a weekend, what are the concrete things that you can do to make your home your community, your neighborhood safer. And then finally, the last part is if you are feeling empowered by those two prior steps, how can you organize at the local level for a more equitable distribution of resources and for changes to keep your city or your community safer from the climate crisis? So for the last maybe 2 years or so, I have loved to start my presentations off with this picture. It is of the Lower Price Hill neighborhood in downtown Cincinnati, Ohio, and it's a northwest facing view. And what I love so much about this picture is how differently you would experience a hot summer day depending on which side of this dotted line you are on. If you're on the left-hand side of this dotted line, there is a mature and robust tree canopy that is cooling the environment, that's capturing particulate, that contributes to poor air quality. There are green spaces and plants that are going to absorb rainwater, making that side less likely to flood, and reducing the urban heat island effect. On the right-hand side of this line, which I cannot emphasize enough to you, is literally on the same block. The picture looks really different. The trees that are there are dead and desiccated, scrawny, scrubby. There's a tremendous amount of asphalt and impervious surfaces like roadways, rooftops, driveways that are going to absorb the sun's heat throughout the day and then contribute to the urban heat island effect by continuing to release that solar radiation. And with very limited green space, the right-hand side of that picture is more likely to flood. And if you were to hop into a satellite and go around Earth's orbit we've got two satellites that are spinning around the Earth, Landsat 8 and Landsat 9, that are constantly taking pictures from space. This is what Cincinnati would look like. And what you saw with that northwesternly view of Lower Price Hill neighborhood looks very similar across the city, with the northwest portion being much more forested, lots more tree canopy cover than the southeastern side. And that has a big impact for the way that we experience temperature. This is ambient air temperature, so more or less how it feels when you're outside at about 7 o'clock in the morning. And those areas with denser tree canopy cover are a lot bluer. They're a lot cooler than that area. So the green infrastructure that we have can make a big difference on how we experience the climate crisis. One of the areas that I get to work in is in New Orleans. And if you've ever been to New Orleans before, you may have heard of the Claiborne Avenue Park. It was this long linear park that ran through an upper middle class Black neighborhood. These 100-year live oak trees provided shade. They soaked up rainwater, and people could recreate there, just promenading, like being seen and seeing people. But unfortunately, New Orleans, like a lot of other cities, had the calling card of urban renewal swiped through in the 50s and 60s when the Federal Highway Administration built its system of highways and had a say in where those roadways went. So that beautiful linear park that was so important to that upper middle class Black neighborhood was razed over and replaced with the Claiborne Avenue Expressway. Because so many of the homes and businesses were razed to the ground and so much more concrete was poured for the roadways and sidewalks around it, that area of New Orleans contributes to New Orleans being one of the worst heat islands in the United States. And because there's so much less greenery, so many fewer trees, that area floods. Okay, so at this point, you probably read my bio. You heard something about cautious optimism, and now I am just bumming you out on a Thursday morning. I promise this is where we take a really sharp turn towards solutions. I just wanted to give you a little context for what things look like and why things are the way that they are. In reality, we already know what to do to fix these things. It's not some mystery of the universe that we need divination to figure out. If you've ever chosen to walk on one side of the street than the other during a hot day, you are probably engaging in some green infrastructure that's contributing to cooling, like trees or shade structures or buildings. If you've ever seen in municipalities, in sort of that hell strip area, water capture mechanisms, you've already seen some of these solutions at work. And there's some really simple infrastructure solutions that our municipalities can put in place and that we can put in place by ourselves without municipal help to help keep our families safer from the climate crisis. Two major categories. One, we want to keep it from getting too hot. It is hot and getting hotter. And I think often when we talk about heat waves, we think of temperatures 90 and above. But data shows that humans can feel pretty negative effects and impacts of heat as low as 80 degrees. So we sometimes think of those blistering heat waves, but generally we do need to work on keeping ourselves and our communities cooler all the time. And you can do that by either blocking the sun's ray or by bouncing. One of the ways that you can bounce light away is by lightening the color of things. You can do that through replacing the shingles on your roof with lighter colors. Or if you live in a place where you have flat roofs, at my work, we do a ton of white roof painting, which not only reduces the temperature around the building, but dramatically reduces utility costs. When it comes to flooding, which is the other big thing we think about when we think of the impacts of the climate crisis, it's important to let water drain unobstructed into sewer systems and to create places for that water to be absorbed and held onto most effectively through things like trees and native plants. And one of the ways that you can begin to build a better understanding of what type of infrastructure would be best in your community is to engage in community science data collection. And you might say to yourself, Kate, I am not a science person. I am not a math person. I promise you, everyone is. If you've ever noticed that one side of the street has more trees than the other, you're a community scientist. You've identified that there's some sort of a notable difference. And that's one of the ways in which you can engage in a better understanding of your community is literally just walking through your neighborhood and identifying where are there street trees that are casting shade or trees in people's yards, and where do those not exist? And that can help you to focus on areas that might need a little bit of help. Next is identifying areas that flood. You can literally go out with a map that you print from Google and kind of mark off places that maybe you avoid with your car or your bike or when you're walking around. And if you're a little bit more interested in getting to do some more advanced community science work, things like air temperature monitors and land surface temperature monitors connect to most people's phones and tablets and can be gotten for as little as 25 to 50 bucks. What's the purpose of doing this type of community science? When my daughter was young, we used to bike her to daycare in the neighboring city, and we would go down this road. And the first year that we lived here, I noticed that it was blisteringly hot the first mile ride with absolutely no shade in the bike lane. But as soon as we would cross over into the next city, we would be hit by this beautiful canopy of cool air. I reached out to the urban forester of the city and said, hey, all trees on this strip seem to be dead. What's going on here? And they said that they suspected there was a gas leak and all of the trees' roots had been smothered and killed. So I pulled together some members of our community, including our local chapter of Mothers Out Front. We got a hold of some gas snippers and were able to collect data on where there were higher than normal. There's supposed to be zero gas in tree wells. That's what normal is. Higher than normal levels of gas. And we're able to advocate alongside the city council to get our local gas company to reline the pipe. Now, if you go down Somerville Avenue, there's about 35 trees that are thriving and have been thriving for the last couple of years. And this type of information that you can gather for relatively cheap can help you understand what changes need to be made in your environment and help you to advocate to decision makers who speak the language of data. They're going to want to not just hear your experience of your basement flooding or of your commute to your kid's school being really hot. They're going to want to see that data so that they can make the case for the intervention and then measure and celebrate the changes after the changes have been made. And there's lots of things that you can advocate for. Things like planting street trees, which not only provide shade, but also are very beautiful and increase property values, which some people appreciate, and just add to a better atmosphere. They can help to calm traffic. I've got some stories I can talk about in the question and answer later if that's interesting to people. And greenery can just add a lot to your environment. Occasionally, you're going to run into some naysayers who say like, well, because of low-hanging power lines or underground infrastructure, we're not actually able to do this type of infrastructure work. But more and more municipalities, more and more people are thinking creatively about how they can use limited space to add things like shade structures or raised beds, which help to get around some of those built environment constraints. I want to show you a couple interesting innovative uses of small spaces. Some innovative uses of small spaces that I think have been kind of interesting. First is in Elizabeth, New Jersey, where this contaminated plot of land behind the library had been put to no use in a neighborhood that floods pretty severely. The folks at Groundwork Elizabeth worked with the library, worked with some students, and were able to plant a microforest, which is a dense planting of trees, shrubs, and ground cover that in 10 years gives the same benefits of a similarly sized forest at 50 years old. So it's incredibly quick at doing things like capturing rainwater, capturing particulate to help keep things like diesel particulate and pulverized rubber out of the air and to have cooling. And then remember that really depressing story I told you about New Orleans? Well, our folks in Groundwork New Orleans were able to build this gorgeous vision to reality park with the help of residents that captures 80,000 gallons of stormwater per year, up to about 20 to 30 per rain event. And my favorite, it actually hides that really gross smelling and looking expressway so that people have a nice quiet place for recreation. So you might say like, hey, Kate, I'm not actually an advocate. How do I get involved in that? Well, learning who your city councilor is something that's very important. I think especially in bigger cities, it can feel like, that person's an elected official. They don't have to listen to me, but they're actually still your neighbors. They live in your community, they live somewhere, they have to share the same space with you. And part of earning your vote is listening to you about issues that matter to you. There's also things like participatory budgeting processes, business improvement districts, and then policies that this municipality will put out for public comment that allow you to advocate for change. And skip over this slide and just go to the what can you do? Okay, so I went a little bit out of order and talked first about advocacy stuff, but I'm going to wrap up this presentation by talking to you folks about what are the things that you can do today if you're nervous about the climate crisis and you want to keep your communities safer, but you don't have a lot of time. Maybe you're caring for family members, maybe you're working, maybe you're going to school. First thing you should do is recognize that there's no 100% solution. There's no panacea. We are kind of locked into a certain level of screwed when it comes to heat and wet. We absolutely need to advocate for things like carbon reduction, but in the meantime, we do need to work on these small 1% solutions that can keep our communities safer. One of the things that you can start to do is identify and take care of clogged storm drains in your community without anywhere for water to permeate or go in urban environments. Storm drains often get awash with leaves, weeds, dirt, debris, garbage, and just going outside with a rake and a pair of gloves and clearing out the storm drain closest to your home can help to reduce some of that nuisance flooding by giving water somewhere to go. Additionally, sometimes the city is not always the one in charge of paving the roads, and they'll hire contractors to do it who are not always aware of where the drainage areas are. So it's also important to report poorly maintained drains to the city, snapping a picture, sending it into your local 311 or C-Click Fix line so that your city knows what needs to be updated. A number of cities are engaging in creative stewardship to get folks to adopt drains in their community. They'll do things like have you sign up online and give you naming rights for that drain. These are a couple of my favorite ones that people have named their storm drains. Alexander the Great, Great Expectations, You're So Drain. So not only do you get the naming rights, you also will sometimes get texts or emails before rain events to remind you to clear out the storm drain. Also, I live in an apartment building and was able to get a rain barrel for free off of my local Buy Nothing community. And this helps us to capture stormwater and reduce the amount of stormwater running into our building's basement. Another really fun and simple thing that you can do is to just reduce the amount of pavement that's around your house. Concrete and asphalt both add to the urban heat island effect, and water can't permeate them, so they contribute to nuisance flooding. So pulling up any excess asphalt that you have around your home is super helpful. Check out depave.org. It is a group that in a number of cities helps residents to organize what are called depaving parties. Basically, if someone has a paved over backyard or their driveway is too big and they want some help, they just pay for the cost of the dumpster and some snacks, and a whole bunch of community members come with pickaxes and shovels and crowbars and helmets and peel off the asphalt and help that person to plant new things in their community. And it can be a really fun way to build community. Trees in your neighborhood are infrastructure. They are just as important as roads or bridges, but they need to be maintained, especially during ever increasing extreme heat events. So if you have a tree on your property, or if you live and walk by or work next to or have at your place of worship or your school a tree that's providing some shade to your community, adopt it and take care of it. And that looks like basically two things. One is just clearing trash out of the tree well. You can even just kick it into the street for the street sweeper to grab. But most importantly, during extreme heat events where you have multiple days above 90 degrees, those trees, even the mature ones, need water. And generally they need about 1 to 2 gallons of water per inch in diameter of the trunk. But you're not going to schlep around like gallons and gallons of water. So what can you do? One of the things that I do is I keep an old milk jug on the porch of my building. When I leave, I'll just go fill it with the spigot, pour it into the street tree box, and then throw that back on my porch. I don't even go up the porch, just kind of throw it over the railing. And this is one of the ways that I help to preserve the infrastructure on my block. Many cities do have more formalized adopted tree programs where they'll again send you emails or text messages to remind you to do things like garbage clean out or watering them, or to allow you to write to the city to say, hey, this tree is looking a little bit sickly. Also really important to support reduced parking minimums. I live in Boston Metro, where that is a very controversial thing to say, but generally we do dedicate too much space to cars, and it's making our communities hotter and more vulnerable to flooding. We need to also preserve trees as much as possible because planting a tree is great, but it is going to be 30, 40, 50 years until that tree is as valuable from a carbon sequestration, air quality, and flood reduction perspective as an older tree that's more established. And then finally, host or attend a block party. One of the most important parts of community climate resilience is getting to know your neighbors so that you can care for one another. The time to get to know someone is not during a crisis. You need to build those relationships now. So, for example, I have a woman who lives across my street, Mary. She's lived there for about 80 years. She's in her 90s, and just getting to know her casually, saying hello when I see her, building that relationship makes it a lot easier for me to knock on her door during a heat wave and just check in to see if she's okay. That relationship building can't be passive. It has to be active, and you need to make an effort to get to know the people around you. You don't have to be their best friend, but just getting a sense of who they are is important. So that's it. I will stop there. Thank you guys so much for your time. Looking forward to the question and answer. For more detailed info, you can check out my book, Climate Action for Busy People. And there's my contact info. And then I will pass it off to Lenny.
Good morning. Good morning. Um,
While we are pulling up Lenny's slides, I just want to say thank you so much, Kate. Looking forward to your section, Lenny. And if anyone has any questions for either of the speakers, if you put them in the Q&A box, we will go through those in a couple of minutes.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Lenny Siegel. Um, Most of us are aware that when we're in a car fueled by fossil fuels, that we're contributing to global warming. What we don't know is that when we do a Google search or ask ChatGPT to write a letter for us, that we're also contributing to climate change. Next slide, please. I'm from Mountain View, California, the heart of Silicon Valley. When I was mayor of Mountain View in 2018, we dedicated this sculpture at the birthplace of Silicon Valley. It's the silicon atom. I've been working since the 1970s to clean up the semiconductor industry, and I'm still doing it. Next slide, please. So the semiconductor industry, that's chips, have a number of environmental issues. They use a lot, the plants that make them use a lot of water, they use a lot of energy, they use extremely hazardous gases that sometimes leak. They use fluoropolymers, which are basically solid materials for tubing and valves and things. And those pollute the environment at the place where they're manufactured, like Parkersburg, West Virginia. We have current plants that make semiconductors use PFAS, forever chemicals, and those are not regulated. They go into the wastewater, where they end up either in surface water or in the biosolids that are spread, as you know, in Maine on agricultural lands. But I'm going to focus today on fluorinated gases. But all these things are considered essential by the industry. Next slide, please. So fluorinated gases are greenhouse gases, essentially. Most of them are PFAS, because they have a carbon fluorine bond, but some of them here, like nitrogen trifluoride and sulfur hexafluoride, don't have carbon, but they're still fluorinated gases. And the thing about, you see on this table, carbon dioxide, that's the base. These things, some of them are like, 22,000, 17,000 times as potent in destroying the planet. Next slide, please. And this is from an industry article where they recognize that these things last forever. That once released into the atmosphere, they will remain for longer than human civilization has existed. Which means you aren't just concerned about the toxicity, because many of these are toxic, or their global warming potential, but the fact is they're going to do that over and over again indefinitely. Next slide, please. So here's some data on the release of fluorinated gases to the environment reported to the US EPA. We don't know whether there are going to be any more reports due to cutbacks by the Trump administration. But basically, about 6 million metric tons a year of fluorinated gases are released into the environment by the semiconductor industry. This lists some of the same chemicals we just looked at. Next slide, please. So this is under the Biden administration, there was an environmental study. The Congress voted not to do any more environmental studies of the semiconductor industry. But basically, the greenhouse gas emissions from the semiconductor industry are about double of what I just showed you in terms of the fluorinated gases because of the energy generated to make the chips. Now, the advocates of the industry point out that it's a small percentage of annual greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. I've got electric cars and solar and all that. I'm contributing a whole lot less than semiconductor industry, but everybody has to cut back. And the semiconductor industry, because it's government supported now and is growing rapidly, is one of the areas where we need to cut back. Next slide, please. Related to some of the semiconductor industry are data centers, which are made out of the chips that I just talked about. And this is, you can't avoid hearing these days about new data centers, the huge investment in the economy, in creating these buildings, basically filled with computers that are made out of chips. These data centers use a huge amount of water. They use an incredible amount of energy. They use heat transfer fluids, actually, just like the semiconductor industry. These are refrigerants. And although they're in closed loop systems like our refrigerator, they leak. And so those release greenhouse gases into the environment routinely. And they use fluoropolymers, which are the solids that I talked about for piping, because these things get really hot. These data centers use all these chips. They get really hot and cooling has to go on. So they got cooling systems that use a lot of water, they use a lot of energy, and they use heat transfer fluids. Next slide, please. So here's a little bit of data on the industry. This is a big deal. The amount of energy that's being used for data centers, and as we see these billions, trillions of dollars being spent in new data centers, we're seeing a huge amount of electricity going into them, and more of that in most places is through fossil fuels. Just read a New York Times article about something, was it New Mexico, where they're building something. It's going to be all natural gas fueled. Google is the biggest employer in my community, and for many years, they were considered a green company. They had solar panels, electric cars. They were really a leader. But now that they're into so-called artificial intelligence, rather than reducing their emissions, they're actually growing and growing substantially wherever Google has data centers or other kinds of operations. So we've had a reversal. This industry was trying to help us save the planet, but now they're so into artificial intelligence that they're on the wrong side of history. Next slide. So what can we do about it? So there are a lot of different things we can do. We can stop giving government money to these projects unless they address their emissions. We can require them to count their environmental costs when they make decisions. The idea is that the planet is paying for, we're paying for the consequences of their emissions in terms of the environmental disasters and public health. They should be looking at those when they decide where to make their investments. We need to restore environmental review. The bipartisan act of Congress, when Biden was in office, they took away the National Environmental Policy Act review of semiconductor plants that were subsidized by the federal government. California's done the same thing. That's been a real surprise, and we're fighting that. Update environmental regulation. A lot of this industry keeps using newer and newer things, and they are not regulated. The PFAS in wastewater is not regulated. We don't see the heat transfer fluids that are used in these industries being regulated. This industry moves faster than the government, so we need to work for legislation and regulations that address the situation. Um, we can directly pressure companies to meet climate goals. And, I talk about smoke and mirrors here. Those are renewable energy certificates. That's when a company claims that it's buying clean energy by paying somebody else. Very rarely is it actually reducing climate emissions. Related to this are the emissions that are made by companies that supply the semiconductor and data center industries. And then finally, and this is kind of similar to what Kate's been talking about, if we inform consumers of the climate costs of using searches and large language models and crypto, I'm expecting a lot of people will think, well, maybe I don't have to, maybe I can do things the old way. Maybe I can use a company that doesn't do artificial intelligence summaries when I do a search. That we do, as consumers, we too can play a role. Next slide. So as I've I'm doing a lot of work with environmental groups all over the country that are trying to control the semiconductor industry, and increasingly now we're seeing communities trying to limit what the data center industry is doing. The fact is that these things which have become so intrinsic in our daily lives, I'm sure I'm guessing everybody who's on this webinar has at least one smartphone. That we have to realize that we've been forced to be part of the problem, and we have to take actions to be part of the solution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lenny, and thank you so much, Kate. All right, we have a couple of questions that have come in, and if anyone else has questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A and the chat. All right. So one of the questions, this is actually Lenny for you and something you just said. You said that the industry are moving faster than the government. And so the question was, can local and state governments maybe move faster? I assume when you said the government, you meant like the federal government. So what should we be asking our local policymakers to do around things like these AI data centers?
So it can be done at every level of government, and even there's a possibility of doing things in the federal government these days. But so right now I'm working with community groups near Syracuse, New York, writing comments on the air permit for the new Micron semiconductor plant that's going to be built there. It's going to be a huge plant, the largest investment in New York history. And so we're writing comments that goes to the state. Meanwhile, we're writing comments that goes to the county for the wastewater permit. So those are things that can be done routinely. You have to know about it, but there are experts, on our side, and it's politics and it's technical. And then there's like the people I'm working with in Phoenix who are just trying to oppose zoning, which would put a data center in their neighborhood. So that every level of government, once you know what's going on, you do have an opportunity to give comments and, of course, elect people who are going to be more responsive.
This is a question for Kate. We hear a lot of people complaining about HOAs, the homeowners associations, for using pesticides or focusing on lawns instead of the type of plants that you were talking about. Do you have any strategies or guidance for folks who are living in communities that are regulated by HOAs or otherwise have like some sort of strict, you can't have plants in your yard?
Yeah. Oh, what a bummer of a thing to have to advocate for, but we got to start somewhere. Thank you for that question. I think that basic community organizing is something that can be really helpful in these situations. It's very difficult for any one individual to go up against small or large institutions to get them to affect change. And there's a couple things that you need, I think, in order to do that successfully. The first is to pull together a coalition of people, other folks in your neighborhood, friends that live within the HOA. And I think when you're trying to figure out like who are your people, who are the people that are most likely to be called towards the thing that's similar to you, think of prior conversations you've had or people who you have positive relationships with and start there, knowing that you're not the only person that needs to do outreach. So if you're close with your kitty corner neighbor and you talk to them about it and kind of make the argument that you guys should be allowed to have a little bit more freedom with your lawn for pollinators and for flood reduction and for heat reduction. Start there and get them to reach out to people that they think would be sympathetic and so on and so forth. I think the other thing that I would say is when you're pulling together a coalition of people to help to make that argument, it's important to have diversity within your coalition. I like to think about having experts, allies, and naysayers. Experts are people who are part of your coalition who basically understand how things work. Maybe someone who's actually read the HOA bylaws and like has a really good sense of where there's an opportunity to advocate, or someone who knows a little bit more about pollinators or flood reduction, or maybe someone who even has the lived experience of having their basement flood or it being too hot. Your allies are people who will show up, but occasionally they don't have a ton of energy and time, but they'll show up to a meeting. Maybe they'll sign on to a letter. And then your naysayers are super important. These are the people who think that your ideas are overblown, that this is a waste of time, that this is kind of garbage, because they'll poke holes in your argument that you can then fill before you have to actually face the institution. So I would say learning what you can about why this is important, communicating to your neighbors to help convince them to come along with you to advocate for change, and then making sure you have diversity within your coalition so that you can attack the problem from a couple of different angles is something that can apply in an HOA situation, municipal situation, school situation, work situation. It's pretty broadly applicable.
So much. And that is actually reminding me of one of the actions that Defend Our Health is participating in right now. We have a children's health scorecard around trying to detoxify and reduce the environmental harms of some of the materials being used in children's clothing. And there is a petition right now. So if folks don't have a lot of time, but they have a little bit of time, they could sign the petition to encourage some of these big children's clothing brands to reduce how much plastic, which is a petrochem-based greenhouse gas releasing, as well as microplastics and other toxic concerns, product. So even if you can't go out to a rally, you can't write 80 letters, you're not getting deep research into this, organizations like Defend are doing some of that work, and then you can sign on to the petition. And that is, that can really help to pressure these companies to make these protective changes that, again, fix it at this much larger system level.
One thing if we just build off of that really quickly, one thing that I think is also important that you just brought up, Emily, is the idea that you don't have to go it alone, and you don't necessarily have to be the one that originates this idea from scratch. And it is important to Google around and use wise phrases in your search engines to find other folks that maybe are doing similar work. So you might look for like HOA, pollinator advocacy in Seattle, and try to use phrases to get in touch with other folks who've been down this road before, and they might be able to guide you and help get you from point A to point B a little bit faster. Or you can join onto their broader coalition efforts that maybe will impact regulation at a level which would then benefit your work. So I think absolutely makes a lot of sense to start your own stuff and also to find other people to hook onto.
You just answered one of the questions, which was, are there resources or ways that we can find sort of solutions that have worked somewhere else that we could copy so we don't have to come up with it from scratch? So thank you for answering that question that I hadn't read out yet. All right, let's take one more question, and then we will say thank you to everyone and wish you a happy holidays. All right, Lenny, this is for you, but I think, Cate, if there's any pieces of this that you'd also like to chat on, feel free. Are there effective strategies for reducing semiconductor pollution or effective local actions in places where data centers or some of these other like concerning facilities are being located?
Well, for sure, these projects are often subsidized by local and state governments, and they can, in addition to doing the environmental review, place conditions on them to require them to use the emerging technologies for destroying the PFAS, for doing better monitoring. There's a lot of science being done these days to improve that. Activists got the Defense Department to sponsor a lot of excellent research. But again, you need regulations to make sure that the companies that are trying to sell these technologies are actually going to use them. But for sure, start by learning what's going on in your community, or other, sometimes, we have a national coalition working on chips Communities United. It can be somebody else's community because it affects you. The thing that I want to close with is that I think Kate and I are both advocating what I call sustainable activism. We talk about the sustainability. Well, how do you live your life, take care of your kids or your animals or and your garden or whatever, and still affect the future of the planet? And the idea is if you can integrate what your activism, what you do personally and what you do politically into your daily lives, then you're going to not only survive better as a person, but be more effective along with your neighbors.
I love that, and I would add to that that I think you're totally right, and to remember that this is a multi-generational fight. I think something that I see people get discouraged at is some big problem will come to their attention. They want to get really involved. They try to go really hard, and then they get exhausted and burnt out. And to Lenny's point, being able to integrate in small ways, medium ways, whatever you feel ready for, and it's okay to step back a little bit and get back into it, but to recognize that this is a fight that has so many dimensions to it, and it's going to happen for a while. So you need to pace yourself.
Well, thank you both so much. And that really aligns with why we at Defend have been running this author talk series for the year. And I'm so glad that you both are our kind of closing speakers for 2025, because those 1%, 1%, 1% little incremental fixes and improvements that we all can contribute to, they sometimes don't feel as important to do because, well, it doesn't solve the problem overall. But those 1%, when hundreds and thousands of us are coming together and doing them, they really do add up and start making such a huge difference. And groups like Defend, we have banned PFAS in a whole lot of consumer products just in Maine, except because then companies are having to comply with that rule in Maine, they're changing their product formulations internationally. And so these little changes can snowball and really can make a difference, not just in your day-to-day, but in the day-to-day and the larger economy to reduce these exposures that are having climate impacts, that are having toxic impacts in our homes. So whether you're concerned about the safety of your food or the safety of the products in your home or the air quality in your community, or you're concerned about plastics pollution in the ocean and rising sea levels and this weather instability that gets caused. All of these things are really tightly tied together, and these little incremental steps that we all can take every day are the way that we can make a difference. And it's really exciting when we do take these steps together. So thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you for everyone who is watching and listening. We really appreciate the work and the effort and the passion that you're bringing to this. And I am really excited for 2026 for people just like us to really be making a difference across so many different places in environmental and public health.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everyone. We'll have a recording of this event, and we'll have the links to Kate's book and a couple of other things coming out in the next couple of days. Wishing you all happy holidays, and here's to a great 2026.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye bye.